I've got my copy here. Can democracy safeguard the future? It's nice and short. Graham told me a while ago that he was planning to write a longer book, but then he got bored and he wrapped it up, which I think it worked. You know, you ended up with it's a really accessible, engaging read on how we can respond to the problem of short-termism in politics and representing future generations by deepening democracy. And I let Graham describe better the key themes of the book. But before we do that, let me introduce our other two speakers that will act as discussants. Amanda Machin from the University of Wittenherdecke, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, so more or less, and Rikki from Goethe University in Frankfurt. So they will share some comments and questions for Graham, and after Graham responds, we'll open the Q&A, where you can just raise your digital hand and ask your questions directly. But in the meantime, you can use the chat. So as they discuss away, you can post your comments and questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it and then select a few questions to kick off the Q&A. So without further ado, Graham, the screen is all yours.
The screen is all yours. I like that. Very good. So I'd like to thank Sonia, Hans, and the rest of the participatory and deliberative democracy community for inviting me to launch my book here. It's really great. It's lovely to see so many friends, or not see some of them. They're hiding, but to know that so many of you are here. And I'm really sorry that we couldn't be together to do this. Although saying that, actually, there's probably more of you here than would have trooped all the way to London. So that's wonderful. Just a couple of things I want to say about. I've been thinking and acting in this area for a long time. Currently, I'm chair of the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development, and I've also been involved in sort of environmental, climate, and social justice activism for as long as I can remember. And so this is a sort of a question has always, been driving me as an academic and an activist about why is it that democracy is failing to deal with with many long-term issues like climate, like biodiversity loss, like health and social care, pensions, and pandemics. Well, pandemics being the latest, obviously, but what is this what is it about democracies that means that they're seem to be poor at dealing with long-term issues? As Sonia said, this was actually going to be a really long book, and I got, it really became clear that I wasn't going to produce it in the way, it was getting really dull, actually, to be honest. So I just thought, I tore it up and just decided over a few months to write something much shorter, and I'm pleased with that I made that decision, and not least for you, because it really is very short, and there aren't many words on each page, so it's it's one of those sort of one sitting books potentially. As I said, the main starting point is that democracies seem to be poor at dealing with long-term issues. If you like, there's a tendency towards short-termism, and I look at why that might be the case, and I look at four drivers of what's often referred to as democratic myopia, and that's the lack of presence of future generations, those who will be affected by the decisions that we're making now, electoral cycles, the impact of vested interests, and some of the dynamics of contemporary capitalism. And I'm not going to go into those things in too much detail. We can talk about those things if they come up. And so my question, and it's a sort of, those of you who know me would know that this would be the way I would ask the question, is how can that tendency towards short-termism be designed out of our institutions? And if you like, can we purposely reshape democratic institutions so that future generations in the long term are given their due weight in decision-making? And I do recognize that that's a limit. That's not the answer to how do we deal with full-termism per se. It's actually, the question is about the design of democratic institutions. I start out in the book by looking at legislatures and constitutions, which are the places where most people start, and where much of the activism and reforms have taken place, and suggest actually that they're incredibly limited, looking at parliamentary committees, changes in electoral rules. And I make the claim at one point, I think, that whoever was designing legislatures almost designed the perfect institution not to deal with long-term issues well. And that was a kind of a claim that I make that I can pick up later in the book. And then what I do is I look at two institutions that I'm quite familiar with. Independent offices for future generations. Two have existed in Israel and in Hungary, and one is still in existence in Wales. And then also participatory institutions, and with a particular focus on climate assemblies and other deliberative mini-publics. I'm using those not to say that these are the two institutions that will solve our problem, rather that they're illustrative of the way that we can design institutions to deal with long-term issues. I'm particularly interested in participatory institutions and what a participatory politics of the long term might look like. And there's a number of reasons for that. And some of this might be picked up as we go through. One is that I think you need a diversity of perspectives on what the interests of future generations are. And I think there's a problem that can happen with elite institutions, including offices of future generations, that particular perspectives on the future, very often dominated by a scientific worldview, will dominate. So I make the argument that diversity is an important precondition, or for me is a precondition for thinking well about the long term. Secondly, I think it's a way of creating political legitimacy for many of the difficult decisions we face. And finally, I guess a throwaway remark, but for someone like myself who's very committed to participatory forms of politics, I want to think about a democracy that's we would actually be proud to pass on to future generations, that actually inculcates the ideals of democracy. In the end of the book, drawing on those institutions that I've looked at, I come up with 5 design principles for democratic institutions of democracy that respond to the long term. And those are independence, diversity, deliberation, empowerment, and then institutionalization, and my claim is that the more we can embed those different design principles within institutions, the more likely we are that they're going to orientate themselves towards the long term. I didn't in this book talk enough about this, but I think there are challenges with actually realizing those 5 goods, and particularly realizing them in together. And in work I'm doing at the moment for a collection with Maya Settler, I'm trying to develop that a bit more. But that's the kind of end point of it. So the book takes you from why have we got a problem with some of the institutions that we're using now, and thinking about why they are limited in their function, and then to suggesting there are other ways that we can begin to think about democratic design for the long term. I shall leave it there. So, Sonia, is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah, absolutely. Much briefer than expected. So that might give Rikki and Amanda more time to question you.
Sonia, when you say shorter than expected, shorter than you would expect from me, or shorter than expected?
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Good point. Amanda, feel free to unmute yourself and start grilling Graham. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, apparently I was invited to grill Graham, so I'm going to try and do that. But I wanted to start off by thanking you for inviting me to comment on this book. And I really like the book. It is very short. I'm just going to hold up my copy. It's very short. And it can be short because it gets to the point very quickly. And Graham's already talked about it, but he highlights this problem of democratic myopia, which is what a lot of us, I think, today in this Zoom seminar are concerned about. So Graham is explaining how contemporary democracies are struggling to respond to contemporary issues like climate change, but also pandemics, biodiversity loss, and health and social care that unfold over the longer term. And what he does in the book really well is to show that this democratic myopia exists, but also not just to highlight the problems, but also to give a very comprehensive summary or overview of the actual practical policy or recommendations or solutions for reinventing democracy, redesigning it so it's more responsive to these long-term problems. So yeah, I can wholeheartedly recommend the book. But I want to make maybe 3 comments very shortly, as quickly as I can, about what maybe questions, that's a politer way of putting it, I have for Graham. From my perspective, the book actually falls into, is a book of two parts. Each half is offering a different approach to reinventing democracy. And these two parts actually correspond to very different ways of thinking about democracy. So one way is representation and one way is participation. And I think there's a little bit of a tension actually between these two parts, which maybe we can talk about later on. So some people would say that if democracy is going to be made more responsive to long-term problems, it needs to be more representative. So it needs to include the representation of constituents who are often excluded, such as future generations. And so that's what Graham does in the first part, is look at, as he's explained, how future generations can be represented in our democratic politics. Now, I'm really sceptical about the possibilities of representing future generations, as well as representing non-human nature, because there are real challenges with representing a constituency that cannot, that doesn't actually exist, or can't speak for itself in the case of non-human nature. And one of the challenges, obviously, is that it's very difficult to know what these constituencies will want and what they will need and what challenges they will be facing. But it's also, and theorists of representation highlight the problems of thinking about representation as just about speaking on behalf of someone else. That's not everything that's happening with political representation. It's a two-way process, as Michael Saywood would say, that actually the representative is actually delineating this constituency and kind of painting a picture of them in a particular way. And so these sort of, that has the authority or is giving themselves the authority to speak, and that is a real problem. And also there's this problem that these representatives are not necessarily held to account by their constituents. And I think this is, I got the impression, Graham, that you were very wary of this too, because you emphasise how important it is that there are more participation and that these representatives are held to account as well. And so this leads us to the second part of the book, as I understand it, which is this idea that actually democracy is not just about representation, but it's also very much about participation. And that's, we know Graham's work is very much within this participation and deliberation approach to democracy. And this idea is that, we put people together from all walks of life, from different backgrounds. They have a calm, rational discussion, and they not only learn about themselves and each other, but they also come up with better policy recommendations. So this is why Graham in the book spends some time talking about deliberative mini-publics or citizens' assemblies, which are very, very prominent today around the world, in Germany as much as anywhere else. But I'm also very sceptical about these forums too, because they correspond to a particular way of thinking about democracy, which is this participatory deliberative way, which basically highlights this, as I said, calm, rational, reasonable discussion, but leaves out some of the really important parts of our politics and our political culture. So there's issues of hierarchy and power relations in these forums that Graham is talking about, which we have to be very careful about in assuming that these forums can somehow generate agreement. But what I thought I would do actually today is just emphasize in particular the way that I think those forums leave out the emotional and passionate identifications and disagreements that are really important in inspiring people to engage with the issues in the first place. Because without these sort of clear alternatives that are, that there's clashes between, I don't think there would be the same engagement with issues such as climate change. And I think this is my work, I feel that's what's missing in our climate politics today, is a kind of clear, strong alternatives that aren't trying to convince everybody, but are, building a movement around themselves. So I would ask Graham if he could perhaps explain where he thinks these aspects, this sort of rhetoric and the passionate things that we see, around politics today, how does that fit within his picture? How much longer do I have, Sonia?
Keep have another few minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just wanted, so that was my main point, I think. But I guess also maybe related to that, what I noticed in the book, and I found it, a lot of what he was saying was in the book is very convincing. But I think at the end I thought, well, Graham is saying, if we build these institutions, or we design these institutions in the way he suggests, then we will get the right policy recommendations. And is that really how democracy works? And will we really be able to, convince the whole of the population, or the demos, whatever community we're looking at, that they're going to come to some agreement on that? And I can't believe that that's the whole story. I think, we have climate deniers, we have climate skeptics, we have people that just believe that actually they have different priorities, and I just can't believe that that's the full picture. So I would ask as well, how would Graham put that dissent, and we see populism in the form of various Donald Trump, for example, is just one example. We see this around the world, and I would just ask, how do these institutions, how do they fit within the picture, the bigger picture of this growing polarization and populism?
That's great. Thanks, Amanda. Rikki.
Yeah, so I think my comments will pick up on a few themes that Amanda's also touched on. Yeah, I also want to start by thanking Sonia and Graham for giving me the opportunity to discuss the book, which I really enjoyed reading. And I certainly agree with Sonia that it's extremely clearly and accessibly written, like all of Graham's work. And so it's a delight to read, and you can definitely get through it in one sitting, as Graham said. And I also think that makes it a very useful resource for those of us who teach democracy to undergraduates. So I find that my students are always really interested in the issues that are covered in this book, and I really struggle to provide them with appropriate resources. So I think this book fills a really important gap for those of us who want to teach about the future of democracy to undergraduates. As Graham said, it's kind of a wide-ranging book. So but I think, so it doesn't cover everything in huge amounts of detail. It's a short book. But one of the things I've really liked about the book that it does well is it doesn't hide the questions that it doesn't answer. So it actively directs us to questions that need researching, as well as the democratic problems that we still have to provide answers to. And I found this particularly very stimulating. It provoked lots of ideas for me. So my comments when I was reading this just completely spiraled out of control. I had to cut 75% of the things that I wanted to say to fit it into these 10 minutes. So I'm basically largely going to focus my reflections around the tension between democratic innovations and our representation regime in addressing climate change, which I think is an idea that's present in the book, but remains somewhat in the background. And I think it needs foregrounding and expanding. And this tension makes me much more pessimistic than Graham about whether democracy can safeguard the future. And so I'm hoping the response to my comments today can dissuade me of this pessimism. So climate change policy is understandably the predominantly long-term decision-making issue covered by the book. And as Amanda already said, it's an area where we're currently seeing lots of experimentation with the kinds of reforms, such as deliberative mini-publics, that Graham focuses on. And for me, a structuring assumption of Graham's book is that democracy's poor record on climate change policy is a problem of democratic institutional design, predominantly the short-termism built into electoral politics. And though I agree there's some truth to that, I want to kind of challenge this framing and suggest that the problem runs much deeper. And I'm going to argue that it needs to be viewed more as a political economy problem, and this has important implications for the kinds of institutional designs that Graham proposes. So first off, I want to set out with a rather depressing summary of the scale of the political economy problem that we currently face, drawing on some figures from Ian Goff's work on carbon dioxide consumption and the minimum income standards. So the minimum income standard, I don't think they're very well known in the democratic innovation community, but the minimum income standard is a consensual poverty measure that uses citizen deliberation to decide the bundle of goods that constitute the bare necessities of a good life. And Ian Goff has calculated that someone living at this deliberatively agreed minimum standard generates 5.6 tons of consumption-based carbon dioxide. And that's substantially lower than the current average person in Britain, who generates 8.9 tons of consumption-based carbon dioxide. But it's still more than 2.5 times higher than the upper bound for sustainable consumption of between 1 and 2 tons per person implied by the 2050 net zero target. So what does this mean? It means if we imagine a hypothetical Britain in which everyone lived at the minimum income standard, so what Ian Goff calls a bare necessities Britain, which is of course an impossibly unlikely scenario, then we'd still massively overshoot the reductions in carbon necessary to maintain a stable habitat. So this means that without some technological miracle, the defining political economy problem of the next 30 years for wealthy democracies will be how can we collectively agree and deliver mass reductions in consumption, reductions that are so large that they challenge what we currently take for granted as the bare necessities to maintain a good life. So that's the political economy problem. Then we have to think about what is the political economy of representative democracy. And as a representative regime, it seems to deliver the exact opposite promise, right? So the representation regime that currently dominates our democratic politics functions as an inequality regime premised on the promise of overconsumption. So what I mean by this is that representative democracy, perhaps apart from the brief interlude after the Second World War, works to legitimate the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few by forcing those elites to compete with promises to raise the consumption level of those outside the elite. So the promise of representative democracy is that unlimited consumption of those at the top is good for everyone because it will also increase consumption for those at the bottom. And if we reject this this kind of premise of representative democracy, of ever-growing consumption, then the oligarchic democratic compromise of representative democracy is fundamentally ruptured. So what I think is promising about the solutions that Graham discusses in his book, such as future generations commissioners and deliberative mini-publics, is that their attempts to carve out democratic spaces outside of this destructive representation regime. So if we think about the UK Climate Assembly, for instance, it's very much framed in these terms with the tagline, the path to net zero. However, I still think there's two risks that we need to be sensitive to when we're thinking about these. The first risk is that it's a very tall ask to expect the people in deliberative mini-publics to step outside the normative order of everyday politics, that growth in consumption is their right and the sign of good government. I think if we look at the recommendations of the UK Climate Assembly, they're quite instructive in this regard. There's very strong support for consumer information initiatives like product labeling of carbon footprint, which don't actually limit people's consumption. But there seemed to be very little support for hard restrictions on consumption. So they didn't want to impose any strict constraints on meat eating. They didn't want to impose strict constraints on flying, just higher costs for frequent flyers. And only 25% of the participants supported a personal carbon budget. So I think we can see the sort of depth of the issue here with the recommendation to ban polluting private jets and helicopters, move into electric when possible. I mean, if we can't even agree that planetary resource limits entail that private jets and helicopters should be off the table, then I think we're in big trouble. So I think the first risk is that basically, rather than reconstituting the representation regime, these initiatives actually just reinforce it because it's very difficult to step outside of this normative order. Then the second issue, which I think is much clearer in the book, is that even if these initiatives do approach the necessary radicalism, then they remain a marginal part of our democratic institutions, and they must feed their recommendations for consumption reductions back into a representation regime founded on the promise of overconsumption. And for me, this is the kind of spectre that haunts the whole book. Graham sort of clearly points to this problem. So in the demise of the two of the three examples of future generation commissions when they challenge the power of politicians, and also in his call that we need to consider designing participation into economic power structures. But I think the problem actually runs a bit deeper than suggested, because the resistance won't only come from the top. if the if representative democracy remains wedded to a representation regime that legitimates inequality through rising consumption, then any recommendations to reduce consumption will be caught in a pincer movement between resistance from the elite, who want to maintain their privileges, and resistance from the masses, who have been promised rising consumption. So I think if we don't solve this political economy problem, then the institutional design solutions of the type described in this book, in my opinion, will be designed to fail. At least in relation to climate change. I think other long-term issues may work differently, right? Like this is very much related to this consumption problem. So alongside this kind of institutional reform, we need to transform the representation regime. I think movements like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future do provide some hope that this might be possible. But my pessimism is linked to my failure to see really any realistic pathway to resolving this political economy problem. So that's really my question to Graham and Amanda and the audience is, what do we do about this? You know, how do we transform this representation regime, and what's the role of these kind of institutional design solutions involved in this? And I think the one principle that Graham outlines that I would really challenge based on these arguments is this, of the 5 principles he outlines at the end of the book, is the independence principle. It seems with the independence principle, Graham, what you're saying is that we need to bypass mass politics. And actually, I think that will fail. What we actually need to do is transform mass politics. And we can't do that by creating institutions which bypass it. We have to do it by creating institutions that have some kind of effect on it. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I should stop there. Sonia, do I have any more time? Or?
I think Graham was so brief that you and Amanda can capitalize on the. So you can add another point. I'll give you another minute or so. Yeah, if you need to.
Yeah. So I just briefly add to something that Amanda said. I'm also extremely skeptical of this representation of future generations. I mean, I think I agree with Amanda that it's impossible to democratically represent future generations because there's no possibility for authorization. And for me, this is the kind of key thing that makes representation democratic. But I think we can discursively represent them. So then for me, the question is, well, what kind of discursive work can the representation of future generations do? And I think it's very useful as a coordinating moral discourse in sort of mass politics, right? So what I mean by that is, a good example is when Greta Thunberg told the delegates of the UN that they should act like they love their children. You know, this is a very persuasive form of democratic rhetoric, which kind of highlights to us the moral impulse of acting on behalf of future generations. So I think that's very useful and motivating. But I think I think the problem comes is when we try and translate that into a kind of policy coordination discourse that is then operationalized through things like commissioners for future generations, because I think it's just incoherent as a form of policy coordination discourse, because it's just, once you try and operationalize it, it quickly breaks down for many reasons, which I think I don't have time to go into. But I think making that distinction could be useful about, well, how should we use it as a form of discursive representation? Moral discourse useful, policy coordination discourse incoherent.
Great, thank you, Rikki. And we can obviously continue the conversation also through the Q&A. And so I invite people to start also using the chat to ask some of the questions. Graham.
I was really cheerful when I came to this meeting.
You knew what was waiting for you.
Yeah. So, gosh, they're really big questions that both Amanda and Rikki have asked, and I guess part of the challenge here is the difference between, you know, the title of the book, which is Can Democracy Safeguard the Future? And actually what I guess my question is can we design democratic institutions that are better at dealing with the long term? And so that second answer is going to always be less than the kind of claim of, is this going to solve all of our problems? And I don't think I want to make, I definitely don't want to make that claim that the couple of design suggestions I make in here are suddenly going to solve the climate crisis or solve the climate emergency. My interest in the book is there a way that we can think about designing democratic institutions so that they are better at considering the long term. And I hope the point is, you both picked up the point as well, but the point in there, and it will be missed by some people, is I'm not suggesting we just need a couple of commissioners and a few deliberative mini publics and everything's going to be fine. I'm definitely using those as illustrative of the way that we might think about institutional design. I would probably challenge Amanda's view that some of these institutions, like deliberative processes, are always calm, restrained, reasonable, and lack emotion and passion. I think I want to say, let me refer you to the French Convention and see what's going on in France with the politics around the French Convention. I think of deliberative mini publics not only got what goes on in them, but also what happens around them, and see that. I mean, maybe I didn't make that point enough in the book, but I think that the kinds of interventions that assemblies can make can be significant in political systems, and I think they can play. Interestingly, I think there's more from the sort of side you're interested in, this sort of agonistic politics going on within and without of citizens' assemblies. Then they've kind of been captured by a deliberative perspective on what they do. I actually think there's a lot more we can say about them. I don't want to claim from the book that these will generate the right policy recommendations. What I do claim from the book is that the function of offices of future generations and the way that future offices of future generations and mini publics are designed gives them a capacity to deal with the long term better than the more common institutions we find in democracies. I share your concern around our epistemic limitations. I recognize that every time we make a claim about the future, it is just that. It is a claim that we're making on behalf of future others. We do that all the time, and we're going to continue to do that. And one of the reasons I want to suggest of pluralizing the inputs, pluralizing participation, or even pluralizing representation, is that we need different perspectives on the future. And there's a feminist argument I run in the book, which is that our current social position affects the way we think about the long term and affects what we think of the interests of future generations to be. So a question you asked me by email, and you didn't necessarily say it, you did say it this time, is about, isn't this just, shouldn't we be more focused on just trying to do better engagement now? And I think better engagement now, more diverse engagement now, actually means better for the long term as well. But it also questions that, and this is always my way, about how you design those spaces, because those spaces will affect the potential for thinking long term. That's my sense, and that introduces all questions about who's the designer, all questions about hierarchy, but every institution does. There's no institution that can escape those questions. So that's just, we have to wrestle with those. These are fragile institutions, all of the ones that I've mentioned, and there is this point in the book about that fragility. And actually, for me, that kind of shows that they can function in response to democratic myopia, because they wouldn't have that fragility. They wouldn't have had that fragility. Wouldn't have been expressed. For Rikki, I don't know enough about Goff's minimum income standards. I'd have to look more about that. And one of the arguments I make quite strongly is to think about a democratic response to questions of long-term, questions of interest of future generations, partly because I want to try and build that political legitimation for difficult decisions and difficult change. And I don't think that trying to these kind of clever elite strategies, like having a certain number of representatives in Parliament, or giving kind of minority vetoes, or especially a particular parliamentary committee, I think we miss the need to actually build that legitimacy in things like solving the health and social care crisis is going to cost, and we've got to take people with that process is going to have to take people with, and that is going to have to be a political process. So I am interested in what it means to legitimize from below. Here I would disagree with people like the kind of critics at the moment like Lafont about the function that potentially mini publics can play. But I want to get away from that. I want to just say that the mini publics and the offices for future generations are just illustrative, and it would be useful to look at other institutional forms. And just finally, on the issue of independence, I think you might have misread slightly what I meant there. I was thinking of independence, and maybe independence is the wrong. I'm trying to find spaces which are independent of particular drivers of democratic myopia, i.e. electoral cycles and vested interests, which still have democratic legitimacy. So I'm kind of trying to create those spaces. And my claim is you can, Offices for Future Generations and deliberative mini publics are two examples of the types of independence that you can have from those drivers of democratic myopia. I think there's a really interesting question to be had about, am I anti-democratic? By saying that, I don't think I am. I think there's all sorts of different types of democratic institution. But the kind of drivers of democratic myopia, we need to think about how we can design institutions that defend against protect against that. So I think I haven't, I can't, it would take hours to respond to the things that you both have said. One thing I would like to say, I'm glad you weren't my two reviewers for the book manuscript, but that's, but thank you so much, because they're really interesting. They are really significant questions. And I think one of the things that's really important when you write a book like this is to make it clear, or try to make it clear, and I might not have always done this, about the scope of what you are claiming in the book. And I think some of the things that you're pointing to are things that I didn't have that I'm not arguing about in the book, but which are really significant for the argument I make. Does that make sense? So I'm not trying to avoid that. And as Rikki says, there's all sorts of things I can't pick up, and I hope that I point those things out. So this is like a partial, both the book and my response is a partial answer to this much bigger problem, which is not about just purely about the design of democratic institutions, but is also about the role of political movements, the role of social movements, the role of the role of different actors within democracy. And this is not a kind of systemic book that's trying to make a claim that this is how we design our way out of this problem, but it's trying to point towards the way that we might design institutions that get us some of the way. And then the question is, how can we and there's another book behind this, which is, what's the strategy for getting these things in place? What's the strategy for empowering these institutions? I say a little bit about that. And again, a lot of my answer is actually to do with popular legitimacy. So for example, Offices for Future Generations need to engage in participatory exercises in order to ground their authority. So there are sort of hints to that, but I agree more could be said. So thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Rikki. Really profound and difficult questions. And that's a partial answer to your concerns, I hope.
Thank you very much, Graham. And Rikki and Amanda, you might have also opportunities to respond later. We still have 20 minutes, but we can push it and go beyond 4 p.m. if the speakers are happy with that and if there are more questions. So I encourage people to raise their hand to ask their question directly by clicking on the participant tab at the bottom. And there are a few questions already in the chat. A lot of questions have come in the past few minutes, so I haven't had time to select my favorite or randomly select them. Maybe I should show my support for sortition and just randomly select a few questions to kick off the Q&A. If I may make a couple of points as well, use my chair privileges. I think I agree with a lot of what has been said today so far, and it seems to me that capitalism really remains the elephant in the room when we talk about climate change and future generations, and perhaps as Rikki was mentioning, a more critical eye at the macro level would help us focus better on the relationship between these participatory processes with surrounding political economy. I also have a more trivial question, Graham, about democratic innovations that doesn't appear a single time in your book. So you talk about participatory and deliberative democracy again, which is good, and participatory governance. And you even mentioned participatory systems. And I think you might be the first author in the field to use the term in published work. So you beat me to it. And so I was wondering if that signals something, that is a move away from democratic innovations. And also, I mean, there is a strong focus on mini publics, and you say that's also one approach, as you explained, to deepening democracy in order to challenge short-termism in politics. And you skillfully respond to some of the criticism leveled at mini publics. I wasn't convinced by all, but for instance, to the arguments that mini publics fail to mobilize broader publics, you argue that entrenched interests make it difficult to have broader public deliberation around the interests of future generations. But I'm thinking that if we want mini publics to really have legitimacy and power, so that we move beyond just focusing on design and the quality of the process and look at outcomes, we need to build more popular support and popular demand for. So if they always appear as something remote, coupled with either representative institutions or independent bodies, even as the Office for Future Generation that you describe in the book, that might be a limit, and perhaps we want to link them better to social movements or also other participatory processes, and so sort of develop this concept of participatory systems. So before I mean, I don't see any hands up yet, but I can read a couple of questions in the chat. Danica is saying that she can't raise her hand because she's the host. So Danica, I'm going to call you in a minute to ask your question. I was looking at it. So there was a question from Sonia. In your opinion, what is the best way to make participation effective and going beyond just plain media attention for a short time? And finally, one last question, and then Graham, you can respond to these initial questions, and then I'll go to Danica. So Andrea Felicetti says, I haven't read the book yet, but your beautiful discussion elicits a question. What if better dealing?
He's there. You could ask him to ask it. He's there. He's appeared.
Oh, he's appeared.
Yeah.
Has he got his hands up? Yeah. Okay, then I would say Andrea, if you want to ask your question, and then Danica, and then Graham can answer these initial few questions.
Yeah.
Andrea, are you there?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, yes, okay. I am. Hello, everybody. It was fine for me if you read it out, but I take advantage of being able to speak out and say, yeah, I was just wondering about what if the proposed changes do a good job, but not a good enough job. So what happens to democracy then? That's my question. I share many of the ideas that Rikki put forward. So I wanted to think a bit, I wanted you to reflect a bit more along those lines. And really looking forward to reading your book, Graham.
Sorry, Sonia, I didn't mean to think that you were that you shouldn't read what he said. I just saw him suddenly appear on the screen.
Ah, okay. No, I don't think everyone can see the same things on the screen. No. So that's why I was a bit baffled, but that's fine. Okay. Because actually it's quite tiring to read from the chat. So I'm always happier when people ask their question directly. So I would say let's take one more question from Danica before you can respond to this initial group.
Yes, thank you very much. So I also have to admit that I didn't manage to read the book yet. So Amazon doesn't go where I currently live, or at least not as fast. Anyway, I will do this, but my question is rather brief. So picking up also on Rikki's comment, I was wondering, in how far do you think that the institutional designs that you are proposing also enable the people to change the economic structure on a long-term perspective? So I was dealing like with related issues over the past year or so. And I mean, there's always this discussion, okay, capitalism as the elephant in the room, and then the perspective on other political issues, on institutional design. And sometimes people tend to ask, okay, but aren't you discussing like the wrong question when you really want to change something about society? But would you say that that institutional design, or particular institutional designs, also can have the capacity to change the economic structure, or to change capitalism? So can work both ways. Thanks.
We're not getting small questions today, are we?
No, let's go big. Go for it.
I just want to say thank you to somebody actually who's on the call. So Stephen Coleman, a while back, he's actually published a book in the same series, and I asked him, because when I was getting fed up with writing this long book, and I saw he published a short book in the series, I asked him his opinion about it, and he kind of persuaded me to go for it. So thank you, Stephen. I can publicly thank you.
It's a great book, Graham. I should say I read it. It's really worth a read. Yeah.
It's clearly not, because I haven't answered any of these questions everyone's asking me. God, these are such big questions. I'm going to start with a trivial one, which is why didn't I use the word democratic innovation? Because when I used it previously, it was about participatory processes, and actually the term Offices for Future Generations are democratic innovations. And I thought, if I start talking about democratic innovations, if I use the word democratic innovations in a more inclusive way, it's bound to be misunderstood. So I'm just going to stop using it. And elsewhere, I'll see an earlier essay as to why I don't think it's a good term anyway. So I thought this was a good opportunity to write something without you. And I think isn't there a sweepstake in the democratic community about whether I can write anything without using the word democratic innovation? So I just wanted to prove that I could write a book. Actually, I didn't even realize I hadn't done it, actually, Sonia, until you pointed it out. So that's good. So making participation effective was a question. And that's actually one of the reasons that I make the argument about empowerment. I draw on Elinor Ostrom's work very briefly. Actually, one of the things I do in the book is draw on everything very briefly, which I think I think there's an argument for brevity, but it hides so many sins. But she makes the point very clearly that that in the studies that she does on community-based natural resource management, the reason why communities are really able to be effective, or when they're able to be effective, it's when they're empowered to actually take control of those resources. And her problem is higher levels of governance get in the way, basically. So I'm a strong advocate of participatory spaces is becoming more empowered. I've always found it slightly bizarre that, and it fits with a comment that someone else made, that we realize that we can't answer, we realize our system isn't working. Political representatives realize they can't deal with a difficult question because of the structures they're in. They hand it over to a mini public, which is an independent space where they make good decisions, and it's handed back into the space where they find it really hard to deal with those recommendations because they're in a space which is structured by democratic myopia. So I'm actually I make quite a strong argument for thinking seriously about empowering participatory spaces, not just deliberative mini publics. And don't get me wrong, I can at least claim to have been talking about these things before they became sexy, but they aren't the only way of doing democratic politics. I don't want to make that argument. I'm using them as an exemplar because I know something about them and I know how they function, and I think they have got interesting qualities. The question about what happens if we institutionalize these sorts of spaces and we don't end up with the kinds of, we don't deal well enough with the long term, like Andrea's question. It'd be really good if we could try to institutionalize them and saw. That would be a good start. So there's a question there. I still think there's a massive, and this reflects on Rikki's point. You know, I'm not saying we can institutionally design our way out of these problems. We still have social movements trying to reshape the normative order. You know, we still have actors all over the place, and so it's not just these. It's not my argument isn't these institutions will save the world. It's the question is, can we do a better job designing our institutions so we've got a better chance of saving the world? Would be the way I would re-articulate it. But there's a whole series of other politics and publics and spaces going on around this that have to be in play. So I do think institutions can have a really significant role in shaping culture. Culture shapes institutions, institutions shape culture. There's an iterative relationship there, but I don't think they're the only thing that shapes political culture. And I suppose, you know, Danica, first of all, don't buy anything from Amazon. Very bad idea. Very bad indeed. I'll send you some alternative links. But in terms of, you know, can these kind of democratic spaces reshape capitalism? They certainly can't do it in one giant leap. That's too much to ask of these kind of spaces. But they can gnaw away at certain practices. And there's questions about, you know, we're reshaping capitalism all the time. The problem is it's being reshaped by people, you know, people who have, you know, by vested interest. So the question is, can we design spaces where we reshape capitalism in a more democratic manner? And I think the answer to that is we can. It's a struggle. It's, you know, really interesting to me that a lot of social movements now are starting to think about institutional design, because they realize actually that's the way we can make some change. So I'm not at all making this argument that the kinds of institutions that I'm suggesting will abolish or reshape capitalism. Just as an aside, a nice question, a funny instance. I remember being in a meeting where we were talking about constitutional change and the potential role of citizens' assemblies, and a left-wing activist said, let's run an assembly on how do we smash capitalism, which I thought was a really great idea, which is clearly not going to fly, but it was really interesting thought experiment. Anyway, so I think I'm going to say again what I said before, which is I'm not making the claim that the things I have put in this book are going to answer all of our problems. They are answering the question about, can we design our democratic institutions so that they deal with long-term issues better? And I think the answer to that is yes. And that is part of a strategy for safeguarding the future.
Thanks, Graham. So some people in the chat are asking if you could post the links you mentioned.
Oh, what? So not being Amazon?
No. Graham, please send those links to all of us.
Oh, I think they were talking, yeah, Hive, the book organization, yeah. Hive, HIVE, or the new one, bookshop.org, I think it's called.
Okay, I'm going to write it for you. Yeah, okay. And so I see 2 hands up, but also I wanted to invite, I can see Paul Vittel is asking a lot of questions in the chat. Paul, do you want just to unmute yourself and ask some of those questions, because they're also very long?
You can't ask all of them, otherwise we'll be here all day.
No. Just very briefly, 1 minute, if you want to, Paul. Oh, in the meantime, Stephen.
No, I'll pass.
Oh, you'll pass?
I'll pass, yeah. I haven't got much time, so better not get going.
Okay, but anyway, Graham, you can also have a look in the chat later.
No, but I know that Paul. So I know one of the things that Paul's concerned about, because we see. I mean, there's many things that Paul's concerned about, and it's about the valorization of citizens' assemblies. And I completely buy this. I completely buy the fact that in Britain at the moment there is a complete, actually not just the UK, there is an obsession with climate, with the citizens' assemblies, as if they are going to solve all of our problems. I have never made that argument, and I think it's a completely, fallacious argument of those people who do think that this is somehow going to be, if you like, the end of politics. And I think there is a real challenge here that at the moment it's the sexy thing, and it's and it's having its moment. The question is us trying to figure out when that moment's passed, what role can will these sorts of institutions play, and how can they be embedded with other institutions, and how can they be? The one thing I would say about the reasons one of the reasons I'm interested in them is because they have the potential to be empowered spaces. They aren't that empowered at the moment, but they have the potential to be decision-making spaces, which many other participatory processes have that trouble of. The decision point of other participatory processes is difficult. Very often goes back to representative institutions. There is the potential with deliberative mini publics for them to be decision making. Now that doesn't distinguish them. There are plenty others that are as well, but I think that isn't how they function now. They could be used in that way.
That's great, thanks. So I would say let's take a couple of questions from the people that have their hands up. So Stephen and then Rikki. You need to unmute yourself. There's always someone. There always
has. It's actually a requirement of a Zoom meeting.
It's a requirement
that someone doesn't unmute. It's actually...
I'm very rarely asked to unmute myself, actually, but I'm really glad that I played a role in encouraging you to write this book, Graham. And indeed, I want this in my obituary that I am the person who encouraged other people to write good books. I think actually there's a theme that goes through today's discussion, which was perhaps not the explicit theme, and that is the difference between better democracy and best democracy. And that is a very old discussion, and it is well worth having, because what I hear from Graham is an argument about incremental improvement of something that is manifestly not working well, and forms of institutional design that might remedy some of the more egregious flaws. And that kind of makes sense to me. I don't see a problem with trying to think about that and not about the very best form of democracy that a society could create. My question, Graham, is about communication rather than about institutions. And I guess I want to ask you two very related questions. One, how should people be talking about the long-term future? I mean, presumably the way to do it is not to start off by saying to somebody, hey, I want to urgently get you involved in a discussion about the long-term future. So there's got to be something else at the kind of level of framing a discussion that we need to be thinking about. But the other question is, of course, given that not everyone is going to be involved in that discussion, how to tell, not only how to talk, but how to tell, how to report, how to say to other people, this discussion has happened and we think that you ought to know about it. And I would be really interested in how that kind of communicative strategy might fit into what you said. Not have you said it in the book, because I don't expect you to. You can't say everything, and it's a really complicated problem. But it possibly is strategically the question that most people would need to check in on before they can actually sign up to what you say in the book.
Oh,
Rikki.
should I go?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a question and kind of a bit of a response as well, because I think maybe people took the wrong impression from my comments, which was not to suggest that Graham thought these things were the magic bullet. He clearly suggests in the book that they aren't. And also not to suggest that they're useless, which I don't think is the case either. I agree with Stephen that we have to, engage in experimentation to find out what works. It'd be very interesting, actually, Graham, to have a new book in 2 years' time where you tell us what happened with all the climate assemblies and whether they helped to present some more long-term policy. But what I really wanted to kind of stress, I think, which maybe got a bit lost, was that have we got the right problem definition? So Graham's problem definition is that the reason we make bad long-term decisions is because of like myopia in our institutional design. And I'm much less convinced than Graham that that's the real problem. My feeling is that the problem is a problem of legitimating an inequality regime. And actually, I don't think that democracies universally bad at making long-term decisions. I mean, there's obviously a short-term impetus to electoral politics, but there are a whole range of other institutions in the democratic system which inculcate long-term thinking. There's permanent bureaucracies. Political parties also have to do reputation management over the long term. Scientific freedom is a really important part of surfacing long-term problems, and so on. And when we look at our current democracies, they're actually quite good at tying themselves into long-term trade agreements, for instance, which promote further inequality. So it doesn't seem that we can't, in a democracy, we can't make any long-term decisions. We can't make certain kinds of long-term decisions. And these certain kinds of long-term decisions are ones that negatively affect the people who have the most wealth and power, which is kind of what we would expect. And so I think like solving this inequality regime problem is potentially more important than institutional myopia. And that's kind of where I would start thinking about how do we solve these problems. Yeah, so it's not, and it's possible that mini publics and independent long-term, I wouldn't call them future generations institutions, but sustainability institutions or something, can kind of be a space in which, or like a focal point for mass politics, in order to kind of try and transform this. But we need to design them as such, if we want that to happen. So that, I mean, the question really is like, Graham, do you buy that problem definition, or?
Great. So Amanda would like to make another comment. So I would say, let's take Amanda's comment and then Graham can sort of summarize all his answers at the end, and we can close there as we're sort of running out of time a bit. So Amanda, yeah, go for it.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back quickly actually on a like, as Rikki did, just to kind of respond to some of the other comments that have been made, and then also add another point or question. So a couple of people have said, including Graham, that these citizens' assemblies have emotions and passions, and I can see that completely. I think what I should have made better is that they're not passions or emotions that revolve around one or strong alternative, because these assemblies or forums generate one set of policy recommendations. So rather than there being these kind of strong alternatives on display, there is sort of one set of policy recommendations that tend to be, from what I can understand, and I'm trying to do further research on this at the moment, tend to be, you know, not that radical at all. And I think Rikki supported that point. And so what I guess I'm maybe going to say quite provocatively is that, so Graham argues that these forums or deliberative mini publics are part of the bigger picture. They can only do part of the job. But what if they actually are hiding, or they're legitimizing the unsustainable status quo? And that's the point I think I should have made when I made my comments at the beginning, because that's the danger of them. And that's, it's not that they're just part of the puzzle, but not the whole thing, but they're actually part of the problem as well. That's I suppose a question I would like to ask Graham. It's a bit of a provocative one to finish on, but sorry.
It's a great question, Amanda. I'll start in the order, just very briefly in the order that they were. Stephen, I think the questions for you ask are great. In terms of talking about long-term issues, this has actually been an issue which, you know, has always been a difficult one for me politically, because I grew up with the term sustainable development. You know, I was a child of, can you be a child of sustainable development? I don't know if you can be, but you know, when I worked in my job before I became an academic, I was working in local authorities, and it was around the Rio Earth Summit, and sustainability was a thing, and we all got really hooked on this idea of sustainability and sustainable development. It had absolutely zero resonance with everyday people. You know, it was a wonks term, didn't work at all. What we are finding though is actually questions around future generations and the way that is articulate, that can be articulated. So it does resonate, and it's one of the reasons that the commissioner in Wales is called the Commissioner for Future Generations and not the Commissioner for Sustainability or Sustainable Development, because they did a lot of work in Wales to think what resonates here. And the title of the bill of the, you know, the bill that that established the Future Generations Commissioner is called the Well-being of Future Generations. And that really resonated with people because it somehow fits with people's imaginative projections. It's a way that I know it's still nerdy, but it's a way that they talk, it's a way it resonates. So I actually think that there is quite a lot of language work being done here. And I think, so that is a way of talking and a way of being, and I think I would look towards Wales at the moment and the way that the Commissioner is trying to articulate and have conversations around this, because the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales requires every public authority to each year to report on its activities in relation to in relation to wellbeing goals, and that starts conversations within institutions about future generations and wellbeing. And my sister, who works in the Welsh School of Music and Drama, she's actually doing work with her students, which has been motivated by the Future Generations Act and the Future Generations Commissioner. So she's having everyday conversations in a music academy about their future responsibilities, which has been kind of fed down from legislation through the Commissioner into everyday spaces. And that for me is just remarkable, you know, and that that's a partial answer, Stephen. I'd love to have a longer conversation with you about it, but I think the Future Generations, that term, it has a better resonance than the kind of previous wonky terms around sustainability, etc. So politically, I think it's really interesting. I like your problem definition, Rikki. I think it's a question that is not the question that's driving the book, as you rightly recognise, and as you suggest, I should have written the book. It would be a very different book to respond to that question. I actually think that in what I write, there is a partial answer to your question when I make the argument about diversity, which is that if you don't have diverse social groups involved in decision-making about the long term, you are going to replicate social injustice across generations, which is a sort of partial response to Amanda as well about why, you know, sort of not Amanda's question just then, but her other, you know, I think I said this already, is part of the argument for democratization, for increasing the voices, enhancing the range of voices, is to have that range of voices on the long term, because people from their social position will recognize how social disadvantage gets transferred across time. And so I'm really, I see that as a partial, and Rikki, it is only a partial response, and I can't say any more now, I think, but your framing is really interesting, and I would suggest you should write a book that is framed in that way. And finally, Amanda, yes, any democratic institution can be, inverted commas, captured or you know, be dominated by in a way that and have its tasks orientated towards legitimating unsustainability. I probably underplay the amount of politics that I think are involved in establishing any participatory space around the capacity it has to challenge and to raise questions. You know, I think there is a legitimate concern around mini publics that, you know, where's the question come from? In whose interest is this question being asked? And I think the more sophisticated that we become, the more these kind of processes are used, the more we will ask that question. We'll become to see that that is an important question. And I'm not sure if she's here now. You know, Sarah Allen ran the Citizens Assembly, Climate Assembly on the UK, with a very specific question that had been set by parliamentary committees. So it's not a surprise that it produces the answer that it produces. What is interesting about it is, given the question that it was asked, it produced a much more radical answer than the politicians who have been asking that question. So even within a limited question frame, it stretched that question. It was a more long-term orientated answer. So I think there's always a problem that participatory politics, and you can see populism doing, you know, populist movements doing this all the time, capture these spaces or articulate these spaces in ways that legitimate unsustainability. And I think that just reminds us that there's a politics here, and it's not a matter of technique or technology. It's a matter of politics as much as getting the space. So we know very well how to design these spaces well. What we don't know as well is how to embed them into the political system well. And that both means in terms of the question, the way that agendas are set and the way that recommendations and outputs affect change. So I think that, that's a becoming more and more recognized. That's becoming more and more recognized by advocates of this kind of approach. So I think that I sometimes have this tendency that I get so sucked into questions of design that the larger politics can be missing. I hope that in the book I've flagged that at various points and said, look, institutional design doesn't just happen in the absence of political movements, etc. But I also recognize that, this is a book that's trying to do a lot of work, and I'm not surprised that I've missed some of these questions.
That's brilliant.
But thank you so much for everybody for engaging with it and taking the book seriously. I'm really delighted to have had this opportunity to talk with so many, talk with and talk at so many friends. So thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Graham. And I think perhaps linking to your last answer, what we might want to do is focus more on how to analyze impact, perhaps borrowing from other fields in political science as well. And you mentioned Eleanor Ostrom in your book, and perhaps starting to use the concept of polycentric governance to examine participatory systems, for instance, and how these participatory processes work within democratic system could be a way forward. But it's been brilliant to hear from you and from our discussants, Rikki and Amanda. Thank you so much for your comments, and the audience for all the questions. And the chat became so busy I couldn't keep up. So I'm gonna share some of the questions with you in case they inspire your new book, Graham. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm not writing in this again.
That's it. Okay. Oh, then maybe Rikki can take over and Amanda. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone. So before we go, just to remind you that we have planned another book launch on the 23rd of March at 3 p.m. Michael Sowards will be presenting his latest book, Democratic Design. So links quite nicely to your book, Graham, and Hans will be chairing the event. And also, if you're attending the PSA General Conference online between the 29th and the 31st of March, the PDD group this year managed to submit 8 panels, and they've all been accepted. So come and join us, because we've got some great work on embedding participatory governance, participation during a pandemic, digital democracy, and a lot of other interesting stuff. So see you again very soon. And thank you very much for the brilliant discussion today. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks very much.